Campside Media.
Hey Campside listeners, welcome back to Inside the Tent, a show where we go behind the scenes of our favorite podcasts and talk to the people who helped bring them to life. My name is Matthew Scher, and I'm a co-founder at Campside Media. I'm also a host of the podcast Suspect. Today I'm going to be talking to Eric Benson about the first season of Suspect, which we made together a couple of years ago. If you want more exclusive content or behind-the-scenes anecdotes from our shows, make sure to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com. Eric, do you remember what you thought after doing Over My Dead Body, which was the first show we did together? Were you like, I like podcasting now? Or were you like, I never want to do a podcast again?
Oh, I was very entranced by the medium of podcasting. One, it was that show got a really big audience instantly. The first show that you and I did, Over My Dead Body, for Wondery, before Campside was even a flicker in its mother's eye. And yeah, there's just more to play with than there is in prose writing for magazines.
Yeah, the audience is bigger too, isn't it? Coming from the magazine world. And then after you release a podcast, you realize by the charts, but then you realize by how many people are emailing you, right? And like how many people have heard it compared to even a really popular magazine article.
Yeah, I always say podcasting sits sort of between writing in like television and film in terms of just the scope of the project, but I think also the audience. You have a show on Netflix, it's like gazillions of people. Podcasting isn't quite that, but it's getting toward that when you have a real hit. It's people hear you who wouldn't come across a magazine article.
I would argue it's also a different audience, right? It's like we're so splintered when it comes to print media, splintered along geographic lines or political lines. And podcasting appeals to a much broader cross-section of human beings.
That's true, right? Wondery or Campside or Sony doesn't mean anything politically to people in the way that the New York Times or the Atlantic or National Review means to people. Even if the stories being published in any one of those places feel kind of non-ideological, it does limit who you're talking to.
Yeah, but I think it goes back to what you were saying too. It's consumed for a different purpose, right? It's consumed partially for entertainment, or primarily for entertainment, one could argue. That's the reason that people are listening. So you naturally get a larger audience than you do if you label something journalism or reporting. But that brings me to Suspect. So we finished Over My Dead Body with Wondery, and then we started kicking around the idea of Suspect. I mean, the way I think about it in my head is like Over My Dead Body was a really good learning experience. In a vacuum, it's not the kind of show that I would have set out to make myself. I was fascinated by the story and the people in it, but it was not a story that had like a special personal resonance or that had a sort of pull in the same way that Suspect did, or the same complexities, I guess I'd argue. When we started thinking about Suspect, which was originally called something totally different, were you aware that there'd be such a discrepancy between the type of podcast we were making with Over My Dead Body and the type of podcast we made with Suspect?
No, because here's the interesting thing. We actually talked about Suspect before we made Over My Dead Body. Because my understanding, I think you got your letter from Emmanuel Fair, who's the protagonist of Suspect, the man at the middle of it all. You got the letter from his jail friend. I forget if they were cellmates or just friends in 2017. 2017 is when we started to discuss Over My Dead Body. And you actually, I believe, pitched another company that was not Wondery, Over My Dead Body, and the show that became Suspect. And they said Over My Dead Body was more interesting to them, and Suspect felt more just like a true crime show that had already been done. It felt more just like serial, is my memory of it. And so, and I didn't know that much. I think because you originated Suspect completely. It was all based off this letter that you had gotten. And so I was like, I think all I knew was like Halloween party, Emmanuel Fair, murder. And it was kind of rejected, and we went off and made Over My Dead Body. And then afterward, like a lot of things that I think turn into meaningful projects, it kind of had like percolated for you for years. And in the meantime, Emmanuel had gotten his second trial and had been acquitted. And so, this was like an idea that you had been wanting to make, I think, for two or 3 years by the time we actually set off to make Suspect. And I think that's always like a very potent place to start a project from, when it's the idea that won't die. And then the story's kind of time has come. Because Emmanuel was acquitted, many, many more people were available for us to interview because the legal stuff had taken its course. He was acquitted. Once you're acquitted for a crime, you can't be retried for it. It was the end of the road for the Emmanuel Fair killed Arpana Janaga legal saga. And so that opened up Emmanuel, it opened up his lawyer, it opened up the cops, it opened up the prosecutors. And so I think when you had told me like, hey, I think I'm going to do this idea, I was like, wow, this is promising. And I think even by the time you told me you were going to do the idea, you had probably talked with Emmanuel, I think at that point a few times. And so we knew that we had the kind of most important person in the story was already participating in the project, and we would see what happened from there.
I totally forgot about that piece of trivia, that there is a podcast company out there that shall not be named that read our pitch and listened to an early version of some calls with Emmanuel and said, it sounds too much like Adnan Syed calling from prison. They were like, we've heard a person calling a journalist from prison before.
And it's funny because now I think we think of like Over My Dead Body feels like the true crime show, and Suspect felt more just like something that was a little different, a little new. And I think it hit the audiences that way, that they were like, ooh, we haven't heard this before.
But yeah, it is interesting that one of the things, going back to what you were saying before, that I think about with Suspect all the time is I'm kind of like, man, I'm never going to get this again. These set of circumstances are never going to happen again. Having the person at the center of the story, and a really good story, be talking only to you and have a relationship with that person. And then after that, having everybody, with one exception, agree to talk and be talking to the press in a lot of cases for the first time. I mean, it might never happen again. There's some luck to it, right? You have to be in the perfect place at the perfect time.
And the story has to find you, because it was a story that would have been very hard for you to find. If you had just been reading, the only thing that had been written about the case was in an alt weekly. Really, there was news coverage when Emmanuel was arrested. I don't even know if there was really news coverage when he was acquitted 9 years later. There probably was a story, but the only real treatment was in an alt weekly story in Seattle. And boy, unless you had lived in Seattle and had been a kind of dedicated reader and it had really grabbed you, if you were thinking, I want to write about touch DNA, or I want to write about ambiguous case where there are a lot of different suspects, if you were just Googling and reading stuff, you never would have come across it. It was only because someone reached out to you with this story, and it turned out to be a kind of perfect story for telling a lot of different things that are important.
Yeah. It kind of has two things going for it, or has a lot of things going for it as a story. I'm not talking about the execution, but the story itself. It has this sort of incredibly compelling Halloween party premise, and then it has everything that's floating under the surface, like all these really big issues having to do with the criminal justice system. I think the phrase I've used is chocolate covered broccoli. It's like the perfect opportunity to teach people through a story like this what can happen to someone. And I guess we knew that going in, right? To a certain extent.
To a certain extent, we did. And there were things I think that we thought were going to be more the focus of the story that became a little less, like DNA. I mean, DNA is a really important part of the story. It's one of the reasons why Emmanuel Fair is arrested. But I think there were so many other things we encountered in doing the story that were just as compelling. Race being one. And I think the kind of ambiguous and imperfect decisions of police and prosecutors about even whether to charge people in a murder. When is there enough proof? How do you decide between two people? I think that's people love stories about hard decisions, like is the dress, what is it, gold or blue or what, the kind of optical illusion. It looks like this to some people, it looks like this to other people. There's that embedded in this story too, because you have two people who are the prime suspects and only one is charged. And why is one charged and not the other? And there are a few different reasons. And I think spelling out those reasons in a podcast is fascinating. And it shows how law enforcement really works.
What was your biggest takeaway? If you think back to the lessons that you learned or the things that stuck with you, what was your biggest from the show?
Every story about someone who's charged with a crime on less than super solid ground. There's the practical lesson to every person listening, which is if the police give you a call, hire a lawyer. So often people get in the situations that they really shouldn't be in because the police are often looking to close or to solve crimes. And sometimes they can play a hunch out too far and innocent people get ensnared in that. Do you have a takeaway?
I think the power of individual people to make something happen within the criminal justice system one way or another was part of it for me, particularly when it came to the jurors, which should be obvious. But when you hear jurors talk about how decisions are made or the lack of decision making, really, in some cases, it can be horrific to think about the power we invest in these people. But I think for me, it was mostly that you start this train moving on a certain path, and it's really hard to get it off that track. It takes over, even if there are reasons to be skeptical or to think that a different outcome should happen. It's like you get invested in a certain outcome. The whole system gets invested in a certain outcome, and everything gets tailored to that, right? Like I'm thinking here specifically, too, of when the prosecutors decided to try Emmanuel again, right after they'd failed to convict him the first time, and tried him again with his basically exactly the same strategy. And it's like they did that in the face of a lot of people and things pointing in a different direction. And they did it also because they were so invested in it, right? Like literally monetarily invested. So it's like, well, I guess we're going to do this again. And that kind of freaks me out a little bit. I think about that a lot.
Well, it's interesting we started talking about Over My Dead Body, because Over My Dead Body, there's a Catherine McBanoa who was the kind of middleman fixer in the Dan Markel murder for hire scheme. She was tried, and there was also a hung jury, and the prosecution retried her, and she was convicted. I have heard that the first jury for McBanoa was like 11-1 convict, acquit. And I'm sure, and the prosecutors clearly knew that. If I know it, they know it. So they knew that it was just one holdout. And I think we've heard that Emmanuel's jury, I think the first one was pretty split, is my memory. If it was 6-6 or it was not 11-1. And I think they were invested in it. And I do think they thought he was guilty. I think the most fascinating thing the prosecutors told us is that they didn't rule out the possibility that someone else, in this case Cameron Johnson, was also guilty, but they didn't feel that they had enough evidence or couldn't make a good enough case to get a conviction. Now, of course, in retrospect, they didn't have enough evidence and couldn't get a conviction for Emmanuel Fair either. But it's just, that was actually one of the things I was most surprised about in all of the interviews that we did that a city prosecutor was willing to say to us on the record that she thought that this crime might have been committed by two people and she had only charged one of them. And by virtue of the fact that she had only charged one of them, the other was essentially always going to be scot-free, and there was no chance, no matter what else came forward in terms of evidence, that he would ever be charged. And that, I think, is really more than the fact that Emmanuel was retried. That, I think, is kind of the core of the story, that they had a theory of the case that they actually didn't pursue in court. They thought something happened that they did not tell a jury because they thought they didn't have enough proof. So they put another story in front of a jury.
Do you ever, I'm sure you do, and we've talked about this with other shows, do some Monday morning quarterbacking about decisions that you've made on a magazine article or on a piece of reporting or on a podcast? I feel strongly that the third season of Suspect, if I had it to totally do over, I'd change the structure of the first episode, for example. I think that there was a different way to do that. And I feel that way about some magazine articles too. I actually don't really feel that way about this season, but I'm curious if you do. Like with the first season, with the advantage of hindsight, are there things that you would have wanted to do differently, structurally or reporting wise?
Every story I've ever done, I feel like I should have reported more, because reporting is one of those things that has no end, right? Like you always feel like you could have reached out to more people. You could have figured out another level of things. However, I do think we reported a lot. We did what we could with the reporting of this story and some. I think the big structural thing that ended up being a real asset to the series was a reveal, not our idea, which was not to start with Emmanuel, to in fact have Emmanuel only emerge really as a central character in the series when he became the main suspect of the police, which wasn't until several months after Arpana's murder. And I think that allowed the show to have a bit of the narrative structure of like a David Grann, like the classic David Grann piece, where you think you're in one story and then it flips a little bit and you're on a different story. And I think that's a really, really exciting place for a listener to be. The first 3 episodes of the show, I think, are procedural. It's about crime. It's about suspects. The police get involved. They're searching. And then it becomes, once Emmanuel becomes the suspect, it continues on that, but it becomes about more of these hard decisions that police and prosecutors make, the fallibility of DNA technology, race and policing. A lot of other things enter the story, but they enter it very organically, and you aren't spoon-fed it at the top. And I think that has a lot to do with the success of the series. And I think if we had started with Emmanuel, I think all of that stuff would have felt a little more like broccoli to people, and they wouldn't have come on the journey, maybe some of them.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what happened with the third season, because we did make the decision to do what you're saying, which is to start with this guy, Leon, and introduce him from the start as he is, which is a really sympathetic, extremely wronged person. Wronged, not wrong. And it stripped a little of the mystery from it. Whereas you're right, like you meet Emmanuel as just one of many. So then you're allowing people to encounter him as the police did. As a sort of last question, I want to ask about the reaction from listeners, which tended to be pretty vociferous one way or another. It definitely became something that people responded to in a certain way, dependent on their personal politics or feelings about the criminal justice system or feelings about race in America. What did you think reading those emails or seeing those reviews or hearing from people who felt strongly about it one way or another?
I'm just going to flip that question back on you, because one thing listeners should know is that the host of any podcast is the person who gets the emails and the brunt of the listener reaction. The other executive producer in the credits is not someone who people think to write. I've heard like Sarah Koenig and Julie Snyder talking about that. Like Sarah Koenig gets the angry serial emails and you got all that stuff. So what did you make of it?
I mean, some of it's pretty predictable, right? I mean, obviously, I like when someone who is aligned with me in a political way and thinks the way I do about the criminal justice system says, "Oh, amazing. Thank you for highlighting this or exposing this to the world." And on the flip side of that, like people who are going to scream at me about, I think one of the most frequent themes of angry reviews was race doesn't matter. Stop trying to make everything about race because it's not about race. That just is easy for me to comprehend on a different level, that there's just a lot of people who have a sort of blinkered view of how the criminal justice system actually works, because of course race has something to do with it. I think the most rewarding were people who, because I did a bonus episode after with Matt Baglio had hosted Over My Dead Body. I was explaining some of this about the political stuff, and then I got all these emails that were like, I'm a pretty right-leaning person. I have pretty conservative politics. I tend to get skeptical about police overreach or the role of race in the criminal justice system. But I listen to your show and I feel like I understand something I hadn't before, which is not the same as saying I agree with everything or your politics or agree with your take on the criminal justice system, but at least they're willing to be open to it, I guess is how I would put it. And especially in this day and age, we're recording this right before the presidential election. It feels like no one can agree on anything and that there's very little middle ground. That felt pretty satisfying. How many people that actually was that felt that way? I don't know. What's remarkable about this show is people did listen to it. Like we had some drop off, but people really listened to it all the way through.
Yeah. And I like to think that we, to the extent that there were people who were convinced by the show, I think we went to lengths to try to really scrutinize all of the elements. I don't think that we just said Emmanuel got railroaded because he was black, end of story. I think we tried to show the mechanisms by which race played into a bunch of other things. The other suspect was represented by a very high-profile lawyer, had many more resources, was just able to navigate the criminal justice system in a different way, stood out less in a suspect pool where Emmanuel was the only person who was black at that party of many people. And so I like to think that if it convinced people, it was because we didn't just hand wave at one explanation. We really tried to spell it out, which is what law enforcement should be doing, obviously. Scrutinizing, questioning themselves, testing out theories. I think they did in this case up to a point, and then probably reached for an answer that was a little too easy. And obviously they did, because it was rejected by two juries. And I think we both feel that it was incorrect, the conclusion that they reached.
Speaking of that, next week or week after, I'm doing a Q&A, giving a talk to a master's class in criminal justice reform run by a cop who's been teaching his police officer students using suspect about evidence collection and interviewing. So we did something right. Anyway, Eric, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks so much to Eric, the rest of the Suspect team, and thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.